Edward approached me with the first draft of the script, which was still in the writing process, probably, I would say, I don't know, maybe around about a year before the shoot. And yeah, I dove into the script and was immediately kind of in this world and enthusiastic about it, and knew immediately that I wanted to do it. And we didn't really speak much before the shoot, actually, because it was such a huge technical challenge in a way, especially because at that time when they started shooting, this was at a maximum height of COVID in Europe, and especially the Czech Republic where they were going to shoot. So I knew I wouldn't have a chance to go to set and record extra sounds of the historical vehicles and crowd and all that stuff that I traditionally I really love to do, but we wouldn't even be let into the country, or we would run a risk of not being allowed to return because all the borders were closed at that time. So the prep work was mainly getting in touch with Viktor Praschil, our production sound mixer, and go through the script with him and flag every unique and important sound that they would have on set, you know, be it crowd or, like I said, vehicles, the possibilities of salvaging as much as possible of the on-set, like props, explosions and squibs and gunshots and stuff like that. That was a major part of the prep work before the shoot. And then, yeah, I did a lot of research on the actual sound of World War I, and for obvious reasons, there's very little to find because they're, you know, the wax cylinders were just about invented almost. Or like barely functioning and really hard to operate in the field. So all there was written records of soldiers from the front that they wrote back home about how the front sounded specifically, which was really surprising to me, because usually you would think they would write about, you know, visually graphic scenes they saw, but it was mainly about the acoustic horror and terror they experienced in this kind of type of war. Edward loves to give very brief and weirdly specific but unspecific briefings, I would say, which are pretty clever in retrospect, I must say, because they leave a lot of space for us to develop. They don't put you into a corset or torso that you have to that you're kind of tied into and that you strictly follow. So yeah, that gave a lot of freedom for us. We never felt like, you know, we have to do this or we have to do that. We just followed our instincts. And yeah, that was pretty much the first talk. I remember I telling him, you know, I think that there's a German word called knochig, which means bony, which was the type of overall feel I described to him that I wanted the film to sound, which kind of sums it up as almost like a documentary style, precise, even when overwhelming, still try to retain a certain level of transparency and realness to it. So yeah, that was that's how it started.
When I was approached, the film was already in a pretty good shape. There was already sound in there where I could imagine how the sound, when it's done, when it's finalized, that it will sound fantastic, and also where it is placed and how it is used. So that was for me very useful. And then I went to Berlin and I saw the film the first time. And I would say the feeling that you have after watching that film, at least for me, it never changed until today. It was right on that day, it was exactly the same thing, that I felt very touched, deeply. I was thinking about a lot of things in terms of my own life, also how I was feeling when I was 18. So there was quite a spectrum that was touching me. And Edward just gave me a few ideas, what he thinks or what he's expecting from the music, and that were like sentences like, I want you to destroy the images. I want to have a snare drum that is played by someone who can't play the snare. Like music for Paul Bäumer's Stomach, for example. That were like a few phrases that he gave me, and then I drove back home and yeah, and while I was driving the train, I had quite a couple of ideas.
In terms of sound, it varies a lot. Like there are some sequences and segments, I would say, that are extremely complex with literally hundreds of tracks going, especially in the Dolby Atmos field, stuff moving and around in the theater, above and below and on the sides, etc. And other scenes are very simplistic and bare bones, I would say, like the moments when Paul wakes up after the bunker collapse, or the kind of shell shock moment in the tank attack, where everything goes away and we're just left with his breathing and the little details of the dust kind of coming down onto the ground, or the cloud of fog kind of blowing by, stuff like that. It's like really simplistic in a technical way. Coming back to your Foley question, Victor recorded a ton of actual running of crowd on set, because it was a huge set, and pretty much everything you see in the film, a lot of that is done in camera. So when we received the first cut, it pretty much, or it was already very close to the final product, background stuff set aside and extra tanks and explosions and stuff. We were working against a film that was already in good shape. It was the effects were very analog looking, real. So it was very inspiring to work very close and precise to picture, and instead of scrambling in the last moment when all the VFX come in and you have to redo a lot of things because they look completely different than they did before. We never ran in these situations, which was really good. So yeah, in terms of unexpected discoveries, we tried a lot of experimenting to create variations in the muddy footsteps, for example. Obviously, there are a ton of those, and it's kind of a key thing and an infamous thing of that warfare. So yeah, the Foley team discovered while they were experimenting with medical silicone, actually, that a block of medical silicone kind of made in a certain way, when you wiggle it, sounded exactly like wet mud, even though it was completely dry. So that's one layer of those footsteps, which came pretty much to our surprise and through experimentation, really, and just by chance, to be honest. Then they built like a half a human body, essentially made from ballistic gel, which is usually used to test bullets in forensic investigations. Has the same density as human flesh, and that was used to create a dummy, full-size doll or dummy that we could throw around, drop from the roof to record body falls and stuff like that. And so yeah, those are probably, I would say, the weirdest tricks of the trade, I would say.
When I drove from Berlin to Düsseldorf, which is a 4-hour train ride, I was actually thinking about a few things, how I want to approach the score. One was that I wanted to find an instrument from that time, but that is a little bit more like a machine. I wanted to find something that creates mechanical noise. That was my thought a little bit. And I remembered that I have that harmonium in my studio from my grandmother that I refurbished, and I tuned it to 440, which was for me very important that it is in tune, because then I could also use it as an instrument with the other instruments. And I also felt that this might be the right one because you use the pedals, there's air in it that is pumping. You have a lot of wooden noise of that instrument. So it sounded to me like very earthy, but at the same time, a good instrument to start in that first 10-minute sequence where, you know, the war machine is in a way described, where the dehumanization of these boys or of the soldiers are explained in a very explicit way, and you know, in a kind of step-by-step storytelling. So you see all the steps until the uniforms are back on another soldier, and then you understand the circle, how, you know, how in a war humans are used like material. And I had the feeling that this harmonium might be raw enough to bring in something that is a little bit maybe like a war horn, but it is still connected to a more modern time, So I drove back home. I recorded on the next day. I recorded that first cue. And when you compose, normally you leave yourself a little bit more time to let it settle, and you listen back. Then maybe you write another 5 or 6 or 7 cues where you're happy with. And the first delivery to the director is always very essential, because when you send it out and he doesn't like what you're doing, it always creates already a little bit of a disconnect, and you have to regain the connection at some point. So I was a little bit insecure if I should send him just one piece, but at the same time, it was clear that if I send it to him, then the language of the music will be dictated by that 3-note motif, and I could use it in all sorts of diverse arrangements and different moods. And my feeling was that it would be nice that it is always an underlayer of even the most beautiful music, that there's always this recognition that we have from the beginning when I present that motif in a very bold way, that when you hear it in a very, like just a violin cue where you just hear a solo violin, that the violin plays it in a beautiful way, but it still uses the same tones. And so I sent it to Edward, hoping that he's happy with it. And I received the next day a phone call, and he was very, he was excited, and he said, like, this is exactly how I was thinking that it could be in the beginning. And that was the basis for then nearly all the other pieces. Well, silence is as essential as music, I mean, I would say silence is a part of music. I consider it not, not disconnected. I have the feeling that, I mean, even breaks, there are composers that worked with a lot of very long breaks, not in film, but in normal, like in classical compositions, where you had even in modern compositions, you have sometimes in a piece of music like 5 or 6 minutes of a break where people are just sitting and waiting for the next note. And I had the feeling that, to enjoy again a piece of music that also helps the film, or that actually underlines a kind of, or brings in another aspect of the movie, it's very important that the audience has a little bit of rest, and that they can actually get disconnected from music at certain levels, and then they could get back into a kind of new hearing process, as well as, I think, in connection with the sound. I always felt that it's nice that there's also spaces just for sound in certain areas that are really realistic and clear, and there's no, let's say, no pollution with music underneath that is, directing your thoughts in certain areas. But then maybe in another moment, I think we have a few nature shots in the film that are pretty quiet, and then there's on the other side nature shots where the music is in a way trying to underline the longing for peace and for a normal life. And I think that we have both aspects, as well as silence where nothing is happening, no music, no sound, in a way. I think that was very important.
There were obvious moments, like the nature shots in the forests, and where we try to make them like go to the edge of them being very realistic and quiet, and not kind of make them like rich, or I would say, like, so they're never tons of birds, or tweeting around when we're inside the forest, etc. So even that there's this calm kind of certain nothingness of peacefulness. So nature pretty much doesn't care about a bunch of humans trying to massacre each other. So yeah, that was obviously on the picture side, structurally embedded in the film already. But then there were moments that were intentionally created as moments of silent sound, even though the action was still ongoing, or it was still pretty wild and chaotic, like the shell shock moment I mentioned of Paul during the tank attack, where everything goes away. And we tried not to fill those moments with something designy in a way. So there are no, there are no real, let's say, a cliche would be to use a spooky drone or whatever. So we try to stand clear of any of these tricks of the trade. We didn't use pull the usual, or the cliche of the tinnitus sound that has been overused in films as well. So we try to find a new approach for these moments. And then shift the perspective gently towards something that breaks the rule. So like when Paul wakes up after the bunker collapse and it cuts to the exterior shot and the camera pulls up, usually your first instinct would be, okay, you bring back all the ambiences, the reality around the battlefield the next morning, etc., and everything's back to normal. So, but instead we just kept Paul's we stay with Paul from the sound perspective, like with his point of view, and then gradually, actually in the next shot, when he starts to walk through the trench, being kind of numb and still traumatized, that's the moment where the rest of the world actually comes back. So we always try to find a a moment of what's Paul's perspective the whole time. Do we want the audience to be in Paul's shoes, or do we want the audience to be an observer, almost like a documentary camera person running with the soldiers through the battlefield? And we need almost like a hyper realism of sound that is super overwhelming. So yeah, we try to create those contrasts, and also find like metaphorical sounds. Like Volker mentioned, the war machine was a topic that Edward mentioned, like to find a sonic representation of the industrialized war machine that was pounding away in the background, the factories that were, provided this endless stream of weaponry, and the connection to the soldiers that essentially became, expendables, just like the tanks and guns that were provided. So there's this subtle design pounding sound through the sewing workshop that Volker mentioned, and then that turns into a machine gun fire over the close-up of the needle of the sewing machine. And that was something that kind of I would say we collaborated in a way where everyone would follow each one's ideas, and then they came together, and then they were tuned, so they would become one element. Like for instance, in that sequence, the rhythm of that pounding machine, I then adjusted when Volker's music came in. So it was kind of always borderlining between the sounds of the harmonium and not drown them out, but become, more like a symbiosis than a separate thing.
The sewing machines were more like the hi-hat, the pumping element, the speed in the cue. I think there's also maybe another example where I think silence, and I would say also the in-between layers, are very nicely, or we can actually see how that worked very well. And that was the scene in the crater with a Frenchman, where I had the feeling that the music is at some point is joining already the very quiet sound and very intimate sound of, where the battlefield was already like disappearing in a way, but you could see everything was going on in the background, and the music is in a way very muffled. So I would say that is a kind of in-between layer between extreme loud music in the battles and extreme like low or very quiet music in the scenes where we have just violin, or when the 5 boys are actually sitting around and they have a meal. There is a very, I would say, more optimistic music in there. But in this scene, for example, I filtered all the music out, and it's just a very, like you have something wrong with, like something is wrong with your ears. The music sounds like cut off at a certain, all the high frequency is gone. And I would say everything is very motivated as well by finding a way of making a genre film in a way not to pull the normal knobs. I would say we always tried in a way to stick away from things that create too much pathos or too much heroism in the film, and I think that worked in those scenes very well. I mean, I've seen it yesterday again, and I have to say, in some areas that the crossover between the two of us is sometimes fantastically done by Lars in the mix in the end. I was here in San Francisco. We did some Q&As, and I have to say I'm so surprised and happy that the audience reactions are extremely positive, in the sense of seeing the film not dictating morality or something like that. That is much more a film about something that can happen everywhere in the world, and that is in a way extremely questionable. And I have the feeling that everybody, and specifically young people, are understanding it, and they are enthusiastic about it, which I think is a very good sign, because we want, of course, it's wonderful when that message of the war of the film, that is definitely an anti-war film, that this is spreading everywhere, and tells people that it doesn't make sense. We're so short on Earth in comparison to the history of the world, that's the only gift we have, and that it totally doesn't make sense to take that away from each other, no matter what. I mean, there's enough space normally for everyone to lay down and get some food. That's all we need in a way. And I think that message comes across or the reactions actually show that the audience is so interested in these questions, and it raises a lot of discussions. And I felt actually very alive after a screening, because so many aspects are discussed, and it's wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, I had similar experiences when we screened the film and in the UK, and the reactions were throughout the ages, really, from young students to elderly people in the audience. It's probably boils down to the fact that the film has no, the superhero soldier who then in the end saves the world in a way. There's nothing like that in a real war, and Remarque himself, it's in the book already, because it's almost like a piece of journalism the way it's written. Thankfully, Edward didn't make a film that put a strange heroic cinematic aspect in there to heighten the drama or whatever. It was completely enough just to show what the film shows, and not make compromises in terms of, okay, now here's the bright side of the war kind of thing. That wouldn't have made sense. So it's probably also a reason why it resonates so strongly throughout generations, or at least I hope so.